It is shortly before midnight on the 26th of March, 1945, in the shattered German town of Schweinheim, and a column of American armor idles in the darkness with its engines running. 10 Sherman tanks, 6 light Stuarts, 3 self-propelled guns, 27 half-tracks packed with infantrymen who have no real idea where they are going. A captain named Abraham Baum, 24 years old, a former pattern cutter from the Bronx, walks the length of the column, checking faces in the gloom. 50 miles of German-held territory separate this position from the objective. No maps worth trusting. No artillery support once they cross the line. No aircraft overhead once darkness properly falls. Baum has been told, in essence, to interrogate frightened civilians at gunpoint if he needs directions. He is about to lead roughly 300 men into the heart of a collapsing but still lethal Reich on the personal order of General George S. Patton, commander of the United States Third Army, to break open a prisoner of war camp that does not appear on a single one of his maps. What Baum does not know, not yet, is that somewhere inside that camp sits a lieutenant colonel named John Knight Waters, Patton's son-in-law. This is the story of Task Force Baum, the raid on Oflag 13B at Hammelburg, and it is, by the admission of the general who ordered it, the single greatest error of his career. It is a story about the danger of a great commander mistaking his own family for a military objective, and about the ordinary soldiers who paid for that mistake in blood, while the truth of why they had been sent was kept from nearly all of them. By March 1945, the war in Europe had entered its terminal phase, but for the men still fighting it, terminal did not mean safe. It meant chaotic and chaos of a particular and dangerous kind. The German prisoner of war system, built to hold captured Allied airmen and soldiers for years if necessary, was disintegrating under the pressure of 2 advancing fronts at once. In the east, the Red Army was tearing through Poland. Camps that had held American officers for months or years were being emptied at gunpoint and marched west, away from the Soviets in bitter winter conditions. One of those marches had begun in January, from Oflag 64 at Subin in Poland. Roughly 1,300 American prisoners set out on foot, covering something in the order of 340 miles over 7 weeks, in temperatures that killed men who simply could not keep walking. Among them, limping along with the rest, was Waters, who had been captured at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia back in February 1943 and had already spent 2 years behind wire. By the time this column reached Hammelburg in Bavaria in early March, the camp there, Oflag 13B, was bursting. What had been built for a few hundred officers now held well over 1,400 Americans, alongside several thousand Serbian prisoners who had been there for years. Conditions were worsening by the day. Food was scarce for guards and prisoners alike. Discipline in the German rear areas was fraying, and hanging over every Allied commander who thought about these camps was the knowledge of what had already happened at Malmedy, where American prisoners had been massacred by the SS during the Battle of the Bulge and the shooting of escaped airmen from Stalag Luft III. The fear was not abstract. As Germany's collapse accelerated, nobody could say with confidence what desperate or vengeful guards might do to the men in their custody, particularly if those camps found themselves caught between 2 advancing armies. This was the genuine and serious problem facing Allied commanders that spring. Tens of thousands of prisoners scattered across a disintegrating country, with no reliable way to protect them, and a real fear that the closer liberation came, the more dangerous their captivity might become. A rescue, if one could be mounted, made a kind of military sense. What did not make sense, at least not by any conventional military logic, was sending 300 men and 60 vehicles 50 miles behind enemy lines with almost no intelligence, no maps, no air cover, and no possibility of reinforcement for a single camp that Allied forces were likely to reach through ordinary advance within a fortnight regardless. That is the puzzle at the heart of this story, and the answer to it has a name: Waters. The plan, such as it was, came together with startling speed. On the evening of the 25th of March, Patton summoned Manton Eddy, commander of his 12th Corps, and asked for a task force to strike Hammelburg. Eddy passed the order down to Major General William Hoga of the veteran 4th Armored Division, the outfit nicknamed the Point for its habit of leading Patton's spearheads. Hoga, by several accounts, argued against the mission. He thought it too small, too improvised, too far beyond supporting distance to succeed. He was overruled. Command fell to Baum, a young company commander from the 4th Armored's 10th Armored Infantry Battalion who had already been wounded once at Normandy, stepping on a mine during the fighting there. When Patton personally briefed him on the objective, Baum's private reaction, which he recounted decades later, was one of simple bewilderment at being handed a mission of this scale. He assembled his force that same night, roughly 300 men, 10 M4 Sherman medium tanks, 6 M5A1 Stuart light tanks, 3 self-propelled 105mm assault guns, 27 half-tracks, and a handful of jeeps. Riding along, ostensibly as an observer, was Major Alexander Stiller, one of Patton's own aides, a man who happened to know Waters personally. Baum, understandably, began to ask questions. Eventually, Stiller admitted the truth. The camp held Patton's son-in-law, and the general wanted him out. The technical case for the raid, on paper, rested on speed and surprise, the doctrine that had served Patton's Third Army so well since Normandy. A fast-moving armored column, striking deep and unexpected, could theoretically punch through disorganized rear-area defenses before the Germans knew what was happening, seize its objective, and be gone before serious resistance could be organized. It had worked before, at scale, with proper reconnaissance and enormous fuel and ammunition reserves behind it. Task Force Baum had none of that. It had 17 basic roadmaps to share among 60 vehicles. No knowledge of the camp's precise location relative to the town of Hammelburg itself, no dedicated air support, and no realistic hope of relief once it moved beyond the range of American artillery. Consider the vehicles themselves for a moment, because they tell their own story about what this force could and could not do. The Sherman, the backbone of American armor by this stage of the war, weighed something in the region of 30 tons. Roughly the mass of a fully loaded modern articulated lorry, and carried a crew of 5 inside armor that by 1945 German gunners knew how to defeat with almost contemptuous ease. Against it stood the Panzerfaust, a disposable, one-shot anti-tank weapon barely a meter long, cheap enough to manufacture in the tens of thousands, and simple enough that a frightened 16-year-old conscript with a few minutes of instruction could use one effectively at close range. It cost the Wehrmacht a fraction of what a single Sherman cost the Americans to build. And yet, fired from a hedgerow or a farmhouse window, it could turn 30 tons of American steel into a burning wreck in an instant. That lopsided economics of destruction, cheap infantry weapon against expensive armor, is a large part of why a column built for speed found itself being bled to death mile by mile on the road to Hammelburg. The task force pushed off close to midnight, and the difficulties began almost immediately. Fighting through Schweinheim itself, before the raid had properly started, cost time and men. A German reconnaissance aircraft spotted the column not long after, forcing Baum to improvise anti-aircraft cover on the move and costing him a Sherman in the process. By the time they reached the open highway toward Hammelburg, it was 2:30 in the morning, hours behind schedule, deep in territory nobody in the column had ever seen, with the element of surprise already badly eroded. They fought their way east for the better part of a day, trading tanks and half-tracks for every mile, the column shrinking with each engagement. By late afternoon on the 27th, Baum halted his lead tank on high ground above Hammelburg and looked down at the camp for the first time. It should have been a moment of triumph. Roughly half his force remained combat effective. What happened next turned triumph into catastrophe. The garrison commander, a colonel named Gunther von Goeckel, appears to have believed a far larger force was descending on him and briefly considered surrender, even sending Waters out under guard to help negotiate. But confusion reigned inside the wire as well. In the chaos of the assault, some of Baum's men opened fire on gray uniformed figures they took for German guards, only to realize they were firing on Serbian prisoners of war who had been held at the camp for years. It was, by any measure, a mission unraveling in real time. Then came the moment Baum had been dreading since he first learned the truth about his orders. He had planned, so far as any planning had been possible, on liberating roughly 300 officers. Instead, the gates opened on more than 1,400 American prisoners, gaunt, some barely able to stand after weeks of forced marching, all of them believing in that instant that their war was over. Baum did the arithmetic that no young captain should ever have to do in the middle of a firefight. His remaining vehicles could carry, at most, 200 men out. He gave priority to field-grade officers. Everyone else was told they could try to walk the 50 miles back to American lines on their own. Through territory, Baum's own column had just fought its way across at enormous cost, or take their chances staying put. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. And then there was Waters. Patton's son-in-law had been shot that same afternoon, hit while approaching the perimeter under the white flag arranged with von Goeckel. Wounded seriously enough that moving him was out of the question. The entire, secret, unauthorized reason for the raid was lying in the camp hospital, unable to be moved, as Baum's shattered column prepared to run the gauntlet back to friendly lines without him. They left after dark on the 27th and did not get far. By first light on the 28th, they were surrounded, hammered from multiple directions by German artillery, mortars, and the shoulder-fired Panzerfaust rockets that had become devastatingly effective against American armor in the war's final months, wielded now as often by teenage Volkssturm conscripts as by regular troops. Half-tracks burned. Tanks were knocked out one by one. Baum himself was wounded, shot in the groin as he tried to escape on foot, and was taken prisoner by German Home Guard units. Of the roughly 300 men who had set out, 32 were killed, and only around 35 made it back to American lines. The rest, over 200 men, were captured. Every single one of the task force's 57 tanks, half-tracks, and other vehicles was destroyed or abandoned. In one of the war's bleaker ironies, Baum's wound is very likely what saved Waters. Because he could not be moved, Waters was left behind at Hammelburg rather than herded onto the trains taking the rest of the camp's prisoners deeper into a collapsing Germany. Baum himself, still wounded, ended up recovering in the same makeshift hospital, tended by the same Serbian doctor. The camp, and the two of them along with it, was finally liberated for good on the 6th of April by the 14th Armored Division, sweeping through in an entirely conventional advance, just 9 days after Task Force Baum's raid had failed to achieve the same result at such catastrophic cost. There is no tidy foreign equivalent to set against Hammelburg, no German mirror image raid to compare it with, because what makes this story remarkable is not that the Germans did something similar, but that it was so thoroughly unlike how the Western Allies normally conducted this kind of operation. Compare it instead with the far larger and more carefully resourced prisoner rescues later in the Pacific War, such as the raid on the Cabanatuan camp in the Philippines in early 1945, which succeeded in freeing more than 500 prisoners because it was built on weeks of reconnaissance, extensive use of Filipino guerrilla intelligence, and a force whose size was matched properly to its objective. Task Force Baum had none of those advantages because it was never really planned as a considered military operation at all. It was assembled and launched within about 24 hours, at roughly a tenth the strength that senior officers in Patton's own chain of command believed the mission actually required. General Hoge's original instinct that this called for a full combat command of 1,000 men or more rather than a single reinforced company was almost certainly correct, and Patton himself would later concede as much. The scale of the miscalculation becomes starker still when set against how the war actually ended for the camp Baum died trying to reach. O-Flag 13B fell to the ordinary methodical advance of the 14th Armored Division just over a week later, without a special mission, without a secret order, and without a single American life lost in the process. 239 men were killed, wounded, or captured, and dozens of tanks and half-tracks destroyed to achieve 9 days earlier what would have arrived anyway, at no cost at all, through the normal progress of the front. The impact of the raid was immediate and almost entirely negative. General Dwight Eisenhower, Patton's superior and the Supreme Allied Commander, was furious when he learned the details, viewing it as a serious misuse of Third Army resources for what looked unmistakably like a personal errand. Patton, for his part, never fully admitted that motive. He offered various official justifications afterwards, including a claim that the raid had served as a diversion, drawing German attention away from a genuine Third Army maneuver further north. Historians remain divided on how much weight to give that explanation, though most agree it was, at best, a convenient afterthought rather than the mission's original purpose. What Patton did concede, in terms unusually blunt for a man rarely given to public self-criticism, was that his only real error of the entire European campaign had been sending too small a force to do the job. The affair stayed largely out of the American press at the time, partly through luck, and partly through the ordinary chaos of a war entering its final weeks, with bigger headlines soon crowding it out. Baum himself received the Distinguished Service Cross, pinned to his hospital gown by Patton personally, a decoration that notably requires no formal investigation of the sort a Medal of Honor recommendation would have demanded. Given what such an inquiry might have uncovered about the mission's true purpose, the choice looks, in hindsight, rather less like generosity and rather more like damage control. What survives of Task Force Baum today exists mainly in the accounts left by the men who lived through it, in regimental histories of the 4th Armored Division, and in the battlefield around Hammelburg itself, where local historians and reenactors have traced the raid's route with considerable care, right down to the hillside where Baum's assault gun made its final stand. Every March, small groups still gather in the villages the task force passed through to mark the anniversary, a reminder that for the communities along that road, this remains living local history rather than a footnote. Baum went on to live a long life, running a garment business in New York, and gave interviews late into his 80s, reflecting on a mission he described, without much bitterness, but with lasting clarity, as one he had never wanted and barely understood the true purpose of until he was already committed to it. Waters recovered from his wound and went on to a distinguished Army career of his own, eventually becoming a 4-star general, though by most accounts he remained deeply uncomfortable with the knowledge that so many men had died attempting to rescue him specifically rather than the camp as a whole. The raid's influence on later military thinking is harder to pin down than its human cost, but it is there if you look for it. Hammelburg became something close to a cautionary case study in the dangers of mission creep and command interference, quietly cited in later decades whenever senior officers were tempted to bend a unit's objectives to serve a personal or political end rather than a purely military one. It sits alongside a handful of other botched special operations from the war's final year as evidence for a lesson the American Army would spend the following decades relearning at intervals: that a rescue mission built on urgency and improvisation, without proper intelligence or a force sized to its task, tends to produce exactly the kind of disaster that unfolded on that Bavarian hillside. Return for a moment to that column idling in the darkness outside Schweinheim on the night of the 26th of March. 300 men, following orders they did not fully understand, for a mission whose real purpose had been kept from nearly all of them. Within 36 hours, 32 of them would be dead and more than 200 captured, and the man they had been sent to save would still be lying wounded in a camp bed, out of reach. Patton called it his one mistake. That is, in a sense, too generous a verdict because it treats as an aberration what was in fact entirely in character. The same instinct for speed, boldness, and unshakable self-belief that had carried the Third Army from Normandy to the Rhine, applied here to a problem that boldness alone could never have solved. The tragedy of Hammelburg is not that a great commander made an uncharacteristic error. It is that the very qualities which made George Patton one of the most effective battlefield generals of the war were the same qualities that, turned toward a private grief rather than a military objective, sent good men to die for a camp that liberation would have reached anyway, within the week, without losing a single life. 32 men did not live to see that liberation. 200 more spent their war's final days as prisoners rather than victors, and the general who sent them never faced a court of inquiry, never lost his command, and, in his own telling, learned only that he should have sent more men next time. That is the story of Task Force Baum. Not a triumph of American arms, but a warning about what happens when the personal and the strategic become impossible to tell apart, even for men entrusted with the lives of others. Patton got his one mistake. 32 families got a telegram.